quite an honor to be here tonight, and certainly my honor to introduce Patrick O'Donnell. Patrick O'Donnell is a combat historian, a best-selling author, and a public speaker. He has written 11 critically acclaimed books that recount epic stories of the American war from the American Revolution to Iraq. He's an expert on elite and special operation units and irregular warfare. Mr. O'Donnell's books are described as nonfiction that read like fiction. And the Wall Street Journal calls Mr. O'Donnell's work combat writing at its very, very best. Tonight, Mr. O'Donnell will talk about his book, Washington's Immortals, the untold story of an elite regiment, changed the course of the Revolution. In August of 1776, a little over a month after the Continental Congress had formally declared independence from Britain, the Revolution was on the verge of a sudden and disastrous end. General Washington found his troops outmanned and outgunned at the Battle of Brooklyn, and it looked as though there was no escape. But thanks to a series of desperate rearguard actions by a single heroic regiment, famously known as the Immortal 400, Washington was able to evacuate the men, and the nascent Continental Army lived to fight another day. That having been said, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Patrick O'Donnell. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It's an honor to be here tonight. For me, I've been writing books for 20 years. I'm just finishing up my 12th book, and it's been a special journey. Each one of the books that I've written has been a journey. Each one of the books that I've written has also found me in one way or another, and that's certainly the case with Washington's Immortals. Washington's Immortals began in 2010 when I was in New York City, and the regimental commander I was with in the Battle of Fallujah, which occurred almost 15 years ago exactly to this month, asked me if I wanted to go to the Met. I said, no. Why don't we go take a tour of the battlefield of Brooklyn? And, you know, it's a special thing to sort of go back in time with somebody you've been in battle with. And that's exactly what we did. We started at Greenwood Cemetery, where the Battle of Brooklyn began on August 27th in the early morning hours. The Marylanders and the men of Delaware were there, and they were facing a cannonade from the British in an attack up that hill. And we, you know, sort of walked that ground there at Greenwood Cemetery, which is an incredible place because it's where there's many notable individuals from New York City are buried, but it's also a battlefield. And we walked up and down Greenwood Cemetery, went to a place called Battle Pass, which is in a park nearby, and walked down sort of the alleys in Brooklyn and found an old stone house. And here is where there was an American Thermopylae. Literally, the men that I'm going to talk about tonight saved the United States. As one historian said at the time, bought an hour more precious in our history than any other. And as we walked around the house, we sort of, you know, looked at the ground where they fought on. Then we came across a rusted old sign. It's now been painted over. But it said, "Here lie 256 Maryland soldiers, Maryland heroes." Somewhere in Brooklyn, under a street or a sidewalk or an empty lot, these men are buried, some of them at least. And it's that, at that moment, I realized that this story had found me. I wanted to know who these men were, and why were they buried under a sidewalk or an empty lot that saved the United States. And what I found was really an extraordinary story, an amazing story, that begins on December 3rd, 1774, on a wintry night in Baltimore. And like so many famous regiments in American history, it began in a tavern, the Marine Corps. And in a tavern in Baltimore City, men of honor, family, and fortune gathered to to arm themselves, to protest what was going on in Boston. At the time, Boston had been closed, and thousands had been thrown out of work by the British, thanks to the Boston Tea Party and a number of other things that had occurred. These men were unique. They were some of the wealthiest merchants in Baltimore, and they were determined to show their solidarity to their brothers in Massachusetts. And they went about forming the Baltimore Independent Cadets. 60 men which pledged their blood, their money, and their honor for a cause. And they began to arm themselves with the best weapons that money could buy. They began to train and prepare for war. And within 48 hours, they would march to any of their sister colonies if they were attacked. And as they trained and prepared, the research on the Marylanders was one of a long period. It took me a long period of time to gather this story. And the focal point, one of the great figures in the story is Mordecai Gist. He's a major in the regiment. He's the first officer. These independent cadets form the core of a regiment that spawns multiple regiments that fight through the entire Revolutionary War. Arguably some of the greatest fighting regiments in the war. And they're in not only the North and the South. But in this research, I found a really sort of chilling letter that stated that an anonymous source wrote in that they were impressed by the way that the men trained and drilled. And then they also went on to say that they would fight an epic battle. In America, basically, Thermopylae. And it's what was in the letter, and this was over a year before the Battle of Brooklyn occurred. It was signed Agamemnon, and it was filed away. But I mean, these men trained and prepared for war, and some of it's an interesting cross section. You've got individuals that are part of elite members of Maryland society, but there's also farmers, tradesmen. And as the war goes on, it's an integrated regiment. There's American Indians. There's also African Americans in the unit. Up to 6-7%. The numbers are never known. And I'll get into some of the characters as we go on. They trained. They built up the force, and it was basically that they began to forge a regiment. It was called Smallwood's Regiment, and by the name of Colonel Smallwood, who was a French and Indian War veteran, who's the major colonel at the time. That they trained, but their first real action is Long Island, and they march up in the summer of 1776 to Brooklyn, and that's where their story begins. The real combat story begins. The British, Washington separates his forces. Half of his forces are in Manhattan, the other half are in Brooklyn or Long Island. It's really an impossible place to defend when you have arguably the greatest navy in the world at the time, which has amassed most of her ships and is able to amphibious land anywhere in New York. And Washington has a near impossible task of trying to defend it. He splits his force between Brooklyn and Manhattan. They dig in Brooklyn Heights. The Marylanders are kind of off on a bony spur that runs off from Brooklyn Heights across what's now Greenwood Cemetery. There's several lines of defense and redoubts and positions. And what happens is the British confront them with sort of what's known as a hammer and anvil. They attack the main force to distract it, and then a massive flanking movement is going around the lines. And that morning, the Marylanders are awoken at around 4 in the morning. They march down towards Greenwood Cemetery. They hold the line against the British General Grant, and then they suddenly realize their utter horror that they're surrounded. They're being surrounded and outflanked, and they have to literally fight back towards their encampments. And it's here that, you know, it's really the epic story of an American Thermopylae takes place. And the pincer movement is being closed on the American army. And the Marylanders, under Mordecai Gist, several companies under the command of Lord Sterling, they attack a nearby position, a house, which there's also a road that leads to several forts behind it. They're able to hit the house or near it. They're able to create a hole in the British lines and allow the bulk of the American army, which is out on this bony spur, to escape back to the entrenchments on Brooklyn Heights. And that's exactly what they do. They charge multiple times into this house, or near the house where the British are lined up. They have several small cannon, several 3-pound cannon, and they're firing canister into the Marylanders. They're firing galling fire from their muskets, and they charge multiple times. But this creates the gap that allows the army to escape, or the bulk of the army to escape back to the entrenchments. And then what happens next is really quite interesting. There's a nor'easter that sets in, and there's a massive storm. And the British, had they attacked that afternoon, they might have been able to overwhelm our defenses. But Howe pauses. I mean, there's a lot of theories out there why. The great theory is that he saw what happened at Bunker Hill, where his men were decimated as they attacked a strong American fixed position. So he decided to play it safe. He decided to dig siege lines and surround the Americans, and then hopefully even have the British fleet sail up behind them and surround them and just take most of the American army, including Washington at the time. And Washington now has a great decision to make. Does he fight? Does he retreat? What does he do? And he calls a council of war at a mansion there called the Four Chimneys in Brooklyn, and the men decide to retreat. And everything that possibly could go right goes right, as far as the weather goes. The nor'easter sets up this rain system which prevents, it's quite interesting, the winds are not favorable for the British fleet. They're not able to sail behind the American entrenchments. They're stopped. Most miraculously. And then that night, one of the great regiments of the war, the Marblehead men, assemble all the boats that they can, and they begin the American Dunkirk, the greatest evacuation arguably in American history. They assemble the boats and they begin ferrying 9,500 Americans across the East River, right under the noses of the British. And thankfully, miraculously, a fog comes in and obscures the movements of the army as they cross, and Glover's men cross. And this is not an easy job. I mean, they're taking 9,500 men across. They have to go multiple times. The oars that they have are padded with cloth to prevent sound. They have to travel over a mile, and they have to make multiple trips. And they're hoping that nobody betrays the evacuation. And there was many cases where that almost occurred. But the men in the American Dunkirk safely are able to bring the American army across to Manhattan. And it's the Marylanders who are the last men out of the entrenchments. They're the rear guard again. Washington trusts these men. And there's some great stories in here from Samuel Smith, one of the main characters in that book, about how he doesn't really quite realize the entire army is evacuated. He runs into Washington invisible in this. And Marylanders are the rear guard once again, and the Army is successfully brought across to Manhattan. And 2 weeks pass, and the British once again land. And they land near Murray Hill. The invasion of Manhattan begins. And there's some, the stories are really quite rich here. Washington is an incredible figure of leadership. He's there in the front lines, and he sees the British land, and he's there with his horse. And he literally is catatonic. That's how it's described. He freezes and he refuses to let his men down or evacuate. He urges them forward, but unfortunately, the bulk of the army is melting away again. And it melts away and falls back. The Marylanders are hold firm, along with Glover's Marblehead Regiment. But Washington is literally the horse by the collar of the horse. He has to be dragged off the field as literally several hundred yards away the British are about to overcome him. And the Marylanders once again under Smallwood now and Gist hold the British back at a place called McGowan's Pass, which is now Central Park. And they hold the line, and the Americans retreat into a series of defensive positions near Harlem Heights. And the Marylanders here at Harlem Heights, it's one of our first victories against British regular troops, against the light infantry actually. The Battle of Harlem Heights, it's an American victory, and the Marylanders are involved in it, and they participated in that action. And it's the story of the Marylanders, once again, as the rear guard. But as Manhattan is being cleared by the British, there's one strong point that remains, and that's Fort Washington. And Fort Washington is garrisoned by nearly 3,000 Americans. It's a strong point. It's now where the base of the George Washington Bridge is located. But picture this mile-long fortress of earthen works and redoubts. That's Fort Washington, and it's occupied by 3,000 Americans, over 200 cannon. It's bristling defensive power. Washington's not so sure he can hold it, but Nathaniel Greene says, look, we can do this. We can hold the fort and hold the British back. Against his own better wishes, he decides to hold the fort. And Johann Rall and Cornwallis and many of the men that are the great battle commanders in the British Hessian force and in the British force participate in this operation. It's really Johann Rall, who the Marylanders meet once again at Trenton, but it's in White Plains. But here, he's an incredible figure that leads the breakthrough into Fort Washington. And there are hundreds of Marylanders. The unit is actually split. There are hundreds of Marylanders inside Fort Washington, but the bulk of the Marylanders with Smallwood and Gist are outside the fortifications. But the fort is breached through very, very heavy fighting that day. And one of the men in my book, Lawrence Everhart, who I really followed through the whole book. He's quite a fascinating character. Lawrence Everhart is inside of Fort Washington, and he's maybe the luckiest man in Fort Washington. He's able to find a rowboat and escape the fort as it's fallen. Rows across the Hudson River and lands near a mansion where Washington is watching the fort fall. And Washington's Immortals is a band of brothers kind of on the Revolutionary War. It's not a regimental history per se. It's in their own words. And the words that I used were the great oral histories of the American Revolution, the pension file applications that many of these men have filed after the war. This is an incredible trove of oral histories that are largely untapped. And I rebuilt the regiment using muster rolls and the pension files and looking for small nuggets of information. And basically this comes about shortly after, around 1818, there's the first Pension Act that's signed. And if you were a veteran of the Revolutionary War, you're allowed to go down to the local courthouse and swear under oath what you saw and did. You're trying to convince a judge that you were there. So in some cases, it was, yes, I was part of the Battle of Princeton and the Battle of Trenton. In other cases, it's Lawrence Everhart saying, I landed on, I escaped from Fort Washington, I landed on the shore, and I saw Washington peering through his spyglass, looking at the men at Fort Washington with tears in his eyes as he saw the fort fall. So this is a different level of, what I'm trying to say is it's the feelings and emotions that many of these men had in this war that we don't even, in many cases it's a war that we think about, it's trapped in the amber of oil paintings. And I try to bring it alive with Washington's Immortals in their own words. And that's what I think that Lawrence Everhart conveyed in some of his statements in his pension file. But the men that survived, that were not in the fort, that were with Smallwood and Gist, then crossed back with the rest of the army to New Jersey, and Washington places them in the rear guard again. They're cutting down trees. They're in vital positions that prevent the British from potentially rolling up the back of the army as it retreats as quickly as it can to what they perceive as the potential safety of Pennsylvania, where Pennsylvania is important because there are farmers that are Whigs or patriots that are that will feed the army and are good, they're there for the cause. Many parts of northern New Jersey, on the other hand, are loyal to the crown. So there's this factor too. The book covers this first American Civil War that was occurring during the American Revolution. The ties where families themselves and men in this book were divided between loyalist and patriot. And this is the case that goes through the entire war, as people shift sides in many ways based on the outcomes of different battles and the projected outcome of the war. Washington makes it across the Delaware River to the safety of Pennsylvania, and this is the time that triumphant souls, as Thomas Paine would say. He had lost, one battle after another. The army that began at 20,000 men had disintegrated down to several thousand. Making matters worse, the enlistments for these men were about to expire. Most enlistments were expiring either on December 1st, or the majority of them were on 12/31/1776. So Washington had a very small window to change potentially the outcome of the Revolutionary War. The trajectory at this point was going incredibly poorly for the cause, and Washington comes up with the grand counterattack at Trenton. There's a Hessian garrison that's manned by Johann Rall, the hero of the Battle of White Plains and also the hero of Fort Washington, and his roughly 900 Hessian soldiers. These are German allies of the crown that are manning a series of pickets in New Jersey. And Johann Rall has the Trenton garrison, and this is the epic counterattack. It's Christmas Day, and Washington asks John Glover if they can get the men across the river. He says, "My boys can handle it." They, assemble Durham boats and flat-bottom boats. There are 3 crossings at Trenton on Christmas Day. And that day, a nor'easter also sets in. There's a lot of snow and sleet. The river is ice choked, and the operation on 2 of those crossing points fails. They don't cross because it's impossible. But Glover's men are able to make the crossing because they had spent years in the Grand Banks, some of the most treacherous fishing waters in the world, and has sustained, untold hardship. So this was something that they were able to do. It's also, they were incredibly disciplined. These are men that had spent years on ships. They understood, almost blind obedience to orders. And they were incredibly tough and hardened. And they brought the army across. And within that group is a small group of Marylanders that are left, less than probably 100. They make the crossing, they attack at Trenton, and the story is quite an incredible one. The Hessians put up a fight, a very significant fight, but a number of factors allow the American army combined with the Marylanders to prevail. They bring over a tremendous amount of firepower, a lot of cannons that are brought over. They're able to overwhelm the Hessians with firepower. But Glover's men also attack Assunpink Creek and cut off the only route of the main route of escape. And they are able to seal that victory for America. And the Hessian garrison, instead of it being sort of a minor victory where they're able to take a few men, they're able to take almost the entire garrison. And that sets up, the Marylanders are in the forefront of that battle, but it sets up what's known as the Second Battle of Trenton, or Battle of Assunpink Creek. And the Washington retreats across the river. He's very happy with his success. But John Cadwalader, who's has a militia group, the Philadelphia Associators, crosses back over. And Washington he's not ordered to do that, but he does it. Washington now finds himself in a position of, do I continue this momentum of the attack? Do I fortify Cadwalader, or do I order him back? He decides to go all in and reinforce Cadwalader. They go back to Trenton, but unlike Johann Rahl's defense, where they try to defend some of the high ground above Trenton and in and around the streets of Trenton, they defend Assunpink Creek, where Glover cut off the Hessians from escaping. And they set up a series of cannon. The Marylanders are there in the front, and it's Cornwallis, the Marylanders' adversary again, from the Battle of Brooklyn, from the Battle of White Plains, from Fort Washington, that leads the counterattacking force. And a large portion of the British Army is moving down to Trenton. They're slowed down by Colonel Hand's sharpshooters, but they make their way to the bridge, and it's the late afternoon, and the Hessians are the first to assault the bridge. Marylanders are on the other side, along with many other units. They hold the bridge, and what's incredible is the great story of American leadership from Washington's position too. He's literally, his horse, there's one account of his horse literally touching the side of the wooden rail of the bridge. He's that close, as men are firing back and forth and holding the Hessians and Britain's elite troops, the light infantry, at bay. They try to cross 3 or 4 times. It fails. It's another situation. Had the British been able to pierce that line, the war might have been over. And Washington has another epic decision to make that morning. Does he continue on the attack? Does he retreat across the river again? Or fight? And he decides to attack again at Princeton. And it's another situation of a battle that initially doesn't go well. But in the 18th century, the general officer in the position of Washington literally changed the course of the battle by his personal actions, and he did that. And he did it with, and some people are just absolutely amazed by his ability to not be killed. I mean, the bullets were literally surrounding him, but none of them actually hit the target, thankfully. And he waved them on, and he was able to lead the army to victory at Princeton, but they were exhausted. But this is just part of Washington's Immortals. This story continues through the entire American Revolution, from the North to the South, and let me highlight a few individuals, including one from Cecil County, Nathaniel Ramsey. Nathaniel Ramsey was a lawyer from this area who was incredibly wealthy. And Nathaniel was in the Battle of Brooklyn. And he was lucky because he was one of the taller members of the regiment. In Brooklyn, the men had to escape through, in some cases, the ones that didn't go through the gap went through the swamps and part of the mill pond. And these men were literally drowning as they were going through the mill pond. And Ramsey was tall enough that he was able to stand. And some men were sinking into the muck in the mill pond. He was able to rescue several men. And it's also, after Brooklyn, his wife, he's one of the, not all of the men and their wives traveled with him, but Mrs. Ramsey, Jenny Ramsey, literally traveled with the army. And there's a covered what's known as camp followers. And in some cases it was the wives of the officers or men. Other cases it was other women that provided valuable services to the army, such as cooking and cleaning, etc., and many other valuable tasks. But Mrs. Ramsey's role was quite unique. They were so wealthy that they had a covered wagon, and she would follow the army with them. And they would set up camp, and her area would be sort of a gathering area for the officers, a way to sort of to talk to one another and break bread, exchange stories. It was a gathering place. And the Ramseys continued to do this up until the Battle of Monmouth, where the British Army was evacuating Philadelphia. And the army was making a long march toward New York. And as they were approaching Freehold, New Jersey, the bulk of the army, the British Army was so large, the line of march was miles long. And Washington hoped to maybe attack the back or the rear where the baggage train was located, and hopefully gain some sort of victory. And they began to attack, but Cornwallis was wise enough to know what was going on, and he brought some of his best units up towards the front of the line, or the back of the line at the time, to counter the American Army, which was under the command of Charles Lee at the time, who had recently been released from a prisoner exchange. And Charles Lee was leading the force, and it was not going well at all. And there's an amazing story about how Washington, who never swears, was literally swearing so much, according to Lafayette, the leaves on the trees shook, calling him a poltroon, etc. That's one account. But at this time, Washington also turns to Nathaniel Ramsey and says, if you can give me 10 minutes, you can save the army. And the 3rd Maryland Regiment, under Ramsey's command, charges into the phalanx of the British Army and stops it. And stops it long enough that Washington's able to bring up the bulk of the army. But in the process of doing that, Ramsey is nearly killed. He's a British mounted trooper, shoots him, misses. He's thrown off his horse, and Ramsay is about to be slain. And there's, depending on which account you like, there's two accounts. One, he covers himself in mud and plays dead. But another British officer finds him and brings him in, makes him a prisoner of war. The other account, which is a little sexier, Ramsay shows his Masonic ring and is given order by a British officer. And the Ramsays, go into prisoner of war status in style. They travel back with the British Army, and they buy a house in New York City, and he's paroled, and he's able to sort of move around the city on his honor and live in style. Unlike the majority of men that were in Washington's army that might have been captured, including another individual that I'd like to talk about, Jack Stewart. Jack Stewart was captured and thrown on a British prisoner of war ship, a hell ship as they're called, that were rotting, floating prisons, and literally thousands died from disease and all kinds of other ailments. But Jack Stewart found a way to get off the ship, bribed his way, they think through his good friend, Samuel Smith. And Samuel Smith, there's a great story there. Samuel Smith had a duel with Jack Stewart earlier, before the war. And the men dueled, and nobody got hurt, but they both became best friends after that. And they think that Samuel Smith may have given Jack Stewart money to bribe his way off the ship, potentially. Jack did a number of other things, but I think one of his greatest feats is his motto in life is "you only live once." And he was a very brash kind of guy that was over 6 feet tall, that came from a wealthy father who was a shipbuilder. But he was very, very daring in battle. And he, at a place called Stony Point in 1779 in July, he was part of what was known as the Forlorn Hope. And the Forlorn Hope is an amazing story. Jack led 120 men for the front lines of the Forlorn Hope. A little bit of context, Stony Point was a position that the British seized from us and built a series of what were called fletches, light fortifications that included mini cannon. And it was basically a bait to sort of draw the American army down in the hope that the whole army would go in there, and the British would then come up the river and come from behind and basically surround us. Washington was too smart for that. He also employed what's really, in many ways, an early precursor to our Special Operations Forces. It was known as the Light Infantry, and Jack and Mordecai Guest and many other Marylanders were part of this unit. They were light, they were all volunteers, but they were also men that were rugged and athletic and willing to take a risk. And Jack was given the honor of leading one of these assault groups. Within the front ranks of this group, this assault group that he had, was known as the Forlorn Hope. And they were armed only with axes to cut apart something called an atabay, which was a almost 18th century version of barbed wire. It was a series of sharpened logs and sticks that formed a rough fortification or a barrier, and it had to be cleared in order to penetrate the inner works of the fortress. And the men in the front were only armed with axes. Officers were armed with spears behind them, and they were all armed with their muskets, but they were unloaded. And it was done deliberately so that there was not an accidental discharge to give away anybody's position. Strikingly, too, the discipline was maintained by an order of instant death by anybody that talked or fired a weapon. And the officers were armed with spears to run through any American that disobeyed. And believe it or not, it wasn't idle words. There's actually an account or two where this occurred. That night, they attacked the atabay, they cut through it, and they storm the fort. A lot of it, you know, it's a great story of not only special operations, a precursor of it, but also intelligence, because the Americans found the weak points by a series of intelligence coups, and they were able to make a plan of attack and had very few losses, seize the fort, all the cannon, and the prisoners. Great story. Jack was awarded a Congressional Silver Medal for that action, and then participated with the unit down in the Southern campaign at the Battle of Camden, the Marylanders fight at Cowpens, at Guilford Courthouse. Jack's even in the Battle of Yorktown. And all of these campaigns, and this is a man of iron, like many of these Marylanders. But it's the end of the war is drawing down. Another individual I cover quite a bit in the book is William Washington, who's a hero of Cowpens, cavalry, as a nephew of George Washington. He's captured at a place called Hobkirk's Hill, where the Marylanders fight. He's brought into captivity in Charleston, and he has kind of a Nathaniel Ramsey captivity. He's paroled, he's treated like a gentleman, and Washington is a celebrity in some ways, and he marries a very beautiful Southern woman in Charleston. The war is over, or nearly over, final days, and there's a wedding, and the officers of the Maryland line are all invited, and Jack Stewart, along with the other officers, ride towards the wedding, and the man, you know, you only live once, falls off his horse and breaks his neck. Yeah. It's a book about you know, incredible heroes and incredible tragedy as well. But the reason why I wrote it is because of the men that are left behind. We don't know where that mass grave is located, and it's my hope that someday that, you know, we can bring that story home and bring that home. Thank you very much.